Good evening. My name is Robert Dijkgraaf, Director of the Institute, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this kind of special Institute lecture, which is actually sponsored by AMIAS, the Association of Members of the Institute for Advanced Study. It's basically our alumni organization. We're very happy to welcome, particularly here, the members of the AMIAS boards who have been gathering here for their annual meeting. So we just had a great meeting, and this organization, founded in 1974, is incredibly important for us because it's the great element of the Institute, of course, is the membership, the visiting scholars that are coming here, have a terrific time, and then sometimes we hope to welcome them back, like our speaker today. And there are more than 6,000 members. That's people who had the experience of working and living at the Institute in more than 50 countries, and we think of that as really the extended Institute family. So our speaker today is a distinguished member of that family, Deva Woodly, Assistant Professor of Politics in the New School, and Deva's research examines the democratic politics happening in a contemporary context. And I must say, just the title, An Antidote to the Politics of Despair, might be just what we needed on this Friday afternoon, reading the newspapers, following the news, and looking outside, where it's not the glorious spring weather that we usually have around this time. She was a friend of the Institute for Advanced Study, member in the School of Social Science in 2012 to 2013, which was also my first year here, so we were two newbies. And I know you found that time productive and motivating, and actually once she was here, she nearly completed a revision of her book manuscript, The Politics of Common Sense, How Social Movements Use Public Discourse to Change Politics and Win Acceptance. And this book was subsequently published by Oxford University Press in 2015. And additionally, while a member, Deva also completed 3 articles, all 3 in some sense direct consequences of her outreach efforts here. She wrote a beautiful piece for the Institute letter. She led an after-hours conversation talk, and she also gave a Friends of the Institute lecture. Now, in addition to her position as Assistant Professor of Politics at the New School, she is also the Director of Undergraduate Studies in Politics, and she obtained her PhD from the university in 2008. So I'm not going to summarize your talk, that's the worst thing to do in an introduction, but you will reflect on democratic insurgencies, how they emerge and from ordinary people and the challenges they provide, and actually how kind of societies benefit from it. At the end of the lecture, in the spirit of the talk, there will be a Q&A session, and then I want to invite all of you to reception in Fould Hall to talk to each other and to Deva in a more informal fashion. But for the moment, please join me in welcoming Deva Woodly to the stage.
Hello. Well, I'm so happy to be back at the Institute. As Robert said, it was a very productive time for me, and in many ways really important in terms of defining my thinking about a variety of different subjects. But tonight, I want to talk with you about new work of mine, and this is a kind of new project that I'm still feeling out, but I can't wait to share with you what I have so far, and to sort of hear your reactions to this argument and my analysis as well. Okay, so the name of this talk is An Antidote to the Politics of Despair, and it is very much out of the contemporary political moment that I come to think about these questions, but it's also because of an enduring interest that I have in social movements and the significance of social movements in our society and in democracies writ large. Basically, this talk comes from an intuition that social movements, right, democratic insurgencies of various kinds, are not a bug, right, as they say. It's not something that we should sort of be trying to avoid and iron out, but is instead a feature of democratic or free societies, right? Okay, so we often think of movements as hazardous disruptions, uprisings that interfere with the normal mechanisms of politics and insurgencies that must be either repressed or reincorporated into the regular legislative process as soon as possible. Recently, President Obama chided the movement for Black Lives by saying that the movement had been, quote, really effective at bringing attention to problems, but claiming that once you, and this is in the quote again, once you've highlighted an issue and brought it to people's attention and shined a spotlight, elected officials or people who are in a position to start bringing about change are ready to sit down with you. Then you can't just keep yelling at them, end quote. He went on to say, the value of social movements and activism is to get you at the table, to get you in the room, and then to figure out how the problem is to be solved, end quote. But I submit to you that he's wrong. The value of movements is something much more profound than bringing power brokers to the table. Movements are what keep democracy from falling irrevocably into all the pitfalls of bureaucracy and oligarchy, as described by Max Weber. Chiefly, these pitfalls, right, are dehumanization, expropriation, and stagnation. In terms of expropriation, I think this is really important. I'll just flip to the next slide here. Oh, maybe. My clicker's not clicking. What do I do? Here. Perhaps I can do it manually. There we go. I did it manually. It's okay. All right. Okay. Oh, that didn't do it. Okay, you accidentally clicked. Okay, that's fine. Okay. Okay. On this question of expropriation, it's important to note that Weber, Max Weber, agreed with Marx about the trouble that would be engendered by the expropriation of workers, right, from the means of production. But he also thought, in a broader kind of viewpoint than Marx, that one of the consequences of centralized and bureaucratized and hierarchicized society would be that we would be expropriated, that is, removed from the source of many kinds of activities, right? So not just economically in terms of workers from the means of production, but also administrators from the means of administering, teachers from teaching, right? Courts from justice, right? And that's something that we do see kind of happening in contemporary society, foretold, right, 100 years ago, as one of the things that are endemic to our form of governance. Okay, but in addition to those dangers of dehumanization, expropriation, and stagnation that tend to follow any kind of centralized governance, right, the trouble with bureaucracy, it's also important to understand that there is an antidote, right? And Thomas Jefferson actually talked about this antidote, over 200 years ago at the founding of the nation. He said that the medicine, right, that this government, our form of government, requires to keep it inclusive and to prevent it from becoming bureaucratized and tyrannical was actually rebellion. In a letter that he wrote to James Madison in 1787, he said, there are three forms of governance, or there are three different ways that you can think about societies being organized. One are societies without government, but these kinds of societies are not particularly conducive to large populations. The second are the kinds of societies that have influence from the people in either a slight or great degree. He was particularly partial to the American form in terms of that second version. And the third are governments who are characterized by force, right? Monarchies and dictatorships of other kinds. And he says, and this is a quote, "It is a problem not clear in my mind that the first condition is not the best, but I believe it to be inconsistent with any great degree of population. The second state has a great deal of good in it. The mass of mankind under that enjoys a precious degree of liberty and happiness. It has its evils too, the principal of which is the turbulence to which it is subject. But weigh this against the oppression of monarchy and it becomes nothing. Malo parallecosum libertatum quam quietum servitutem which is Latin, translated, I prefer the tumult of liberty to the quiet of servitude. Even this evil, and this is a continued quote, is productive of the good. It prevents the degeneracy of government and nourishes a general attention to public affairs. I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing and as necessary in the political world as storms in the physical. Unsuccessful rebellions indeed generally establish the encroachments of the rights of the people who have produced them. An observation of this truth should render honest Republican governors so mild in their punishment of rebellions as not to discourage them too much. It is a medicine necessary for the sound health of government. So I take this view at its word, that rebellion, democratic insurgency, is a medicine necessary to counteract what is a tendency toward oligarchy and bureaucratization that is basically unavoidable in any kind of centralized government that's meant to serve a mass public. It's also important to note that we actually know the effects, right, of bureaucracy and oligarchy in our current system. This is not a theoretical problem. This is not simply something that thinkers of old have been afraid of. We know from empirical research today that from scholars such as Kay Schlossman, Sidney Verba, and Henry Brady, that socioeconomic status is one of the best predictors of political participation. This is not because the well-off are congenitally more politically oriented, but because the things that are required to participate in politics are money, skills, and time. And these resources are distributed vastly unequally in our country. In addition, we have the work of Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page that shows us that national representatives are dramatically more responsive to upper-class constituents. These conditions do not lend themselves to a well-functioning democracy. Instead, they reinforce extant and growing economic and political inequality, as well as political polarization. If you are horrified or surprised by this year's presidential nominating contest, you should not be. It is the fruit of democracy in dysfunction. It is what happens when we have the processes, that is elections, and institutions, functioning branches of government, that our form of government requires, but we don't have the fellow feeling. According to public opinion polls, Americans right now trust each other and our governing institutions less than we ever have since we started to ask such polling questions at the beginning of last century. But in some ways, this should not surprise us. This tendency toward dehumanized and expropriating bureaucracy and democracy-destroying oligarchy is like the physical reality of entropy. Without a force or forces to act against it, it will overtake all that we have built. It is for this reason that I submit to you that periodic political insurgency is a term that I actually use from Iris Young, but she took it from the Institute's own Michael Walzer. Anyway, this political insurgency often, though not always in the form of organized social movements, is necessary for democracy to flourish. In this way, political insurgencies are not brief interruptions in the smooth functioning of the governing apparatus, but are instead a life-saving feature of a free society. Otherwise, what we are left with is a politics of despair. But what is a politics of despair? We'll just move on this way. Okay. Yes, but I have another slide. I have another handy-dandy slide. Okay. Okay. All right. So there are many ways that we can talk about a politics of despair. And oftentimes we talk about a politics of despair in a kind of colloquial fashion, right? The same thing that Robert was talking about. We read the news, we watch CNN, and we think, what is happening, right? I'm feeling despair. But I think that there is, I want to submit that there are scholarly grounds for a more rigorous definition with more full implications, okay? For this, I want to talk about Iris Young. In her book, Justice and the Politics of Difference, Young offers a critique of what she calls the distributive paradigm. She says that when we think about justice, we have misconceived the question to a very great degree. Often, what thinkers like Rawls, Dworkin, Bruce Ackerman, and others posit as the purview of justice is, quote, the morally proper distribution of social benefits and burdens among society's members. But Young says, this way of thinking about justice causes us to misunderstand what is at stake. The distributive paradigm implicitly assumes that social judgments are about what individual persons have, how much they have, and how that amount compares with what others have, when the focus ought to be on not what people have, but what they can do. That is, how their doings and havings are structured by institutional relations, and how those institutional relations constitute their positions, okay? So, Young goes on to note that this way of viewing the world, though common, that is the viewing the world through the distributive paradigm, saying like, if you have as much as the other person has in terms of rights, in terms of opportunities, in terms of respect, right, then we can say that the world is just, right? And if we develop institutions, particularly if we develop institutions that divvy these things up in the right proportion, then the world is just. But Young says that's not the way that we should look at it. Instead, we need to think about not what people have, but what they're actually able to do. This is important to think about in the context of our contemporary world. So for instance, in terms of rights, power, opportunities, and respect, we may have, right, the same rights, but not be able to exercise them in the same way. And the way that we exercise those rights are often structurally, that is, systematically different depending upon our position in society, right? The way that we're able to exercise those rights varies systematically depending on race, depending on gender, depending on socioeconomic status, and other kinds of things that social scientists can use to predict the probabilities of your life chances, okay? So for example, a 90-year-old woman in North Carolina has the right to vote, but she very likely cannot exercise this right in this day and age, right? Because of recent voter registration law or voter ID laws that were passed in North Carolina, older people who are often poorer people or black and brown people have to produce documentation that they may not have, right? I have a 91-year-old grandmother right now who lives actually in New York. If she had to produce her birth certificate in order to vote, she would not be able to vote. She was born with a midwife at home in North Carolina, right? So she has the right to vote, but she could not exercise that right to vote. Similarly, all children in the US have the right to a public education, but most of them, if they go through the public education system, will receive one that is segregated and in dilapidated facilities and that delivers a low-quality facsimile of an education. Similarly, all of us have a right to have our debts, right, our financial debts, adjudicated separately from any criminal trespasses, and we should never be imprisoned because of financial indigence. But all over the country, the practice of imprisoning people because they can't pay court fees or even private debts is commonplace. So if we think about rights in a distributed paradigm, it causes us to miss how people actually can conduct their lives, right? Justice is not only in the having, but in the ability to do, right? Okay, so Young says that this first-order inaccuracy in our perception of what justice entails causes a fundamental misunderstanding of the world. We are related and separated by our relations and the processes these give rise to, in addition to brute facts and material goods. Since relations and processes almost always determine the ways that material goods are distributed, right, and also non-material goods like rights, respect, power, then to speak of one having a just portion is often to beg the question. But this critique goes deeper, And this is how it leads us to understanding a politics of despair. It's not only that this distributive paradigm does not accurately apprehend the world as it is, or even that the notion of justice implied by it is atomistic, but instead, it's that this view of justice causes us to be depoliticized and it is demobilizing. Young asserts that the consequence of this distributive paradigm is that in conflict resolution, right, we can only see that people are asserting their claims to their selfish interests, right? In our sort of distributive paradigm, which gives rise to a kind of interest group pluralism, we can only make claims, right? It doesn't matter if those claims are based on justice or they're based on our self-interest, okay? Because the distributive paradigm is all about me having my just portion and you having your just portion, it also makes it hard for us to see systematic effects, right? It's a profoundly individualizing or individualist way of seeing the world, which is an atomizing way of seeing the world, okay? It causes us to view the public in a fragmented way. It also makes it so that it's difficult for us to inquire about the basic structures, assumptions, and constraints that shape the ways that we're able to make decisions in our society. Okay. Young notes, or this is what she says, bringing all of these aspects of justice into view requires a more comprehensive perspective than the fragmentation of interest group pluralism allows. Because one needs to know the relationship between the desires of different interests and the collective consequences of their simultaneous enactment, it's difficult to see things through this lens. Under these circumstances, it is little wonder that citizens are often politically apathetic. However, I want to argue that the disengagement of many citizens from politics and the cynical and reluctant engagement of many others in politics is not a symptom of apathy, but instead of political despair. Political despair is a lack of efficacy brought on by an often accurate assessment of current conditions that views social and political ills as innumerable and natural forces of human nature that cannot be combated, only avoided or girded against. It is the experience of social groups who are similarly situated persons and recognize themselves as such, who recognize a profound constraint on their lives and life chances that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. It impacts their ability to both develop themselves and to determine the trajectories of their own lives. That is, it doesn't affect the rights they have, it affects the way that they can exercise those rights. The despair comes from not believing that you don't have the ability to make money or have the ability to get an education or have the right to vote or have the right to participate in politics, but instead from knowing that even though you possess, right, your just portion of these objects, right, or concepts, that you can't exercise those rights because of the conditions of your life, right? Despair comes from knowing that you need to go to college in order to get a good job, but knowing that you cannot go to a four-year college, not because your grades aren't good enough, but because you don't have enough money, because you have to stay at home and help your family and work, right? Despair comes from not knowing that you need to stay out of the net of the criminal justice system, but knowing that just walking from your home to your school, you may be stopped and searched, right? And whether you have anything on you or not, right, that's illegal, you may be detained because you look like a suspect in a crime, okay? Despair comes from the feeling that no matter what you do, your life chances are truncated, okay? All right. This political despair is a feeling that nothing can be done. It's the feeling that politics is itself a dead end, and that whatever paltry remedies there are for human suffering and political injustice, you must eke them out piecemeal on your own. As the individuals who succeed are either lucky or blessed with unusual gifts. Alternatively, these conditions may be stoically endured, with the triumph of the human spirit read not as striving to improve conditions, but instead in whether and how one nobly dies, as Claude McKay evocatively wrote. So we have this situation, and this is Nancy Rosenblum in the Boston Review, where in the American perspective, we have this idea of personal responsibility that's almost a kind of beyond the level of folk wisdom, that's almost a kind of civic religion. But Nancy Rosenblum wants us to think, and I also want to think with her, that perhaps this ideology of personal responsibility is not something that we talk about amongst ourselves in order to lift ourselves up because of our virtue, but instead because it's the result of a politics of despair. It's the result of the feeling that nothing can be done collectively, that there's no way to actually address the conditions that create the structures and relationships that truncate people's lives and life chances. It's also the case that these conditions affect different groups of people differently, right? And that's something that's also difficult to see through the personal responsibility lens, right? Which is also something, the interest group pluralism lens that Young talks about as well. Okay? Now, while the distributive paradigm and the interest group politics that it gives rise to does not necessarily produce this despair, the atomism and autonomy that it presupposes in its social ontology does. This is because, regardless of the American social theology of personal responsibility, in what Nancy Fraser calls the actually existing world, people arrive from the moment of their birth into a context. And that context is structured, meaning that many of the personal characteristics that are observed or bequeathed upon us at our birth, race, gender, family, region, religion, nation, etc., will shape, though not fully determine, the way that we experience the rest of our lives as surely as the structuring laws of physics do. It is for this reason that conceptions of justice based on and unreflectively embedded in the distributive paradigm can only, as Machiavelli says, come to grief. Okay? This is because justice is not quantifiable and distributable in this way. Instead, it has to be based upon, and this is an insight from Amartya Sen, our conceptions and evaluations of justice have to be based upon not the ways that goods are distributed, whether they're material goods or conceptual goods like rights, respect, and power, but instead on the ways that people's lives actually go, right? If we're thinking about what's just, we can't just think about institutions and laws, right, as they're written, but we have to think about the ways that people's lives actually go. And so if we as social scientists, if we as people in society are faced with the fact that, black families are likely to have 3 times less wealth than white families of comparable incomes, we have to think about that in terms of justice. Because it's not the case, well, it's no longer the case, although it was up until 1970, right, that you can discriminate bold-faced, right, based on race, in terms of whether you'll give someone a loan or whether you will give someone a job, et cetera. But it is absolutely the case that the way that people's lives go, right, indicate that there is still very much a problem, okay? And the ideology of personal responsibility does not get us to where we need to be in terms of justice, okay? All right. So what do we do? And this is where the concept of insurgency comes back in. Young's conception of justice in a politics of difference dovetails nicely with Amartya Sen's work when he talks about the capabilities approach to justice, right? And he's the one who's emphasizing very much that justice has to be based on how people's lives actually go, right? In Sen's capabilities approach, we have to be focused on what we actually know about people's life chances. And Young calls our answer, right, to this capabilities approach, enabling conceptions of justice. So how do we forward an enabling conception of justice? Okay? The first thing we do in an enabling conception of justice is focus on, as I've said, not what people have, but what people can do, okay? So instead of a distributive paradigm, we have to think through what I call a liberatory paradigm. This is one that points to whether one can take advantage of or exercise and enact the activities associated with having necessary social goods, both material goods and non-material goods like rights, power, etc. Okay? Okay. This is because the distributive paradigm imagines people and their just portion as being determined by what characteristics they are said to possess. But instead, the liberatory paradigm wants to focus on what people are able to actually learn, do, participate in, how they're recognized, how they express themselves, whether they play, and all the activities that derive their possibility and meaning from the social context in which they take place. Okay, so the liberatory paradigm takes account of what people are actually able to do in the meaning-giving social context that they're actually positioned in. So that means taking account of habits, rules, norms, and people's relations to institutions like the criminal justice system, the education system, courts and law, etc. Okay? Enabling conceptions of justice take as their starting points people's actual conditions. So it would take seriously, for example, the ways that in this society right now we have a situation in Flint, Michigan, where through a series of governmental neglect, right, at every level, the people have been poisoned with lead in their water, which means a generation of children may have permanent and irreversible brain damage. Now, who's at fault for this? The levels of bureaucracy are difficult to ascertain, and everyone is sort of pointing the fingers to someone else. But the basic fact is that an enabling conception of justice doesn't focus on who's at fault, right? But instead focuses on how is it, right, that it came to be that the people in this jurisdiction were not able to speak up for themselves, were not listened to, that no one has been held accountable, and that no discernible plan has been put in action to resolve the actual problem, right? We can also think about an enabling conception of justice in terms of the criminal justice system. So for example, the movement for Black Lives began really in 2011, 2012, when Trayvon Martin was killed in Florida. But it didn't really come to fruition as a movement until 2014, when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. Now, the movement was triggered by these dramatic, anyway, the mobilization in the street was triggered by these dramatic deaths, right, these executions. However, what was underlying the movement in each of those cases, particularly in the case of Michael Brown, was a municipality and a city that had been financing itself by stealing from the poor, right, in its borders, right? You had a municipality that refused to finance itself based on taxes, right, like sort of taxing the population, but instead financed itself based on fees, court fees and traffic tickets, and had internal documents that encouraged police officers and court officials to extract greater and greater portions of resources from the poor defendants that came before them, right? So the context, right, the social context of these insurgencies is really important. They're triggered by dramatic moments, which are important, but the movement for Black Lives is not only a movement about not being killed in the street, right, by police officers. It's a movement about how we are valuing people's right to exist in the world, right? People's ability to actually enact a life that is free from incursion by the state for petty offenses, free from being basically I've lost the E word for when you extract resources that you have no right to. Someone give it, yeah, that's right. Right, so that's the social context, okay? Because it's about how people's lives actually go, right? It's not only about the rights that they have in sort of in theory, it's about how people's lives actually go. Okay. So, I'm going to give you an example from St. Louis County, and this is not actually from Ferguson. This is a more general example. Okay. In a wonderful example of in-depth reporting from the Washington Post, Radley Balco, who's a really wonderful reporter, reports that in St. Louis, and this is not unique to St. Louis, by the way, right? When I talk about debtor's prison, that's also something that's linked to this as well, right? Meaning that people are often stopped for traffic tickets, which result in bench warrants if they're unpaid, and then those people are taken to jail. Right? That happens in St. Louis County, it happens in Alabama, it happens in Washington State, it happens all over the country, right? Okay, but these examples are from St. Louis. Okay, he tells a story of a woman named Nicole Bolden, who has a fender bender with another motorist, right, in town. When the police arrive, Bolden is filled with dread because she knows that she has unpaid parking tickets. True to her fear, she is arrested on site in front of her children, and then she is taken to jail where she remains for 2 weeks because she can't make bond, okay? During that time, fees accrue not only for the unpaid parking tickets, but also for a fee for being in jail, court fees for processing her case, and they mount and mount in such a way that it's unclear whether she'll ever be able to pay these fees. And with each level of unpaid fees, there's more jail time in the offing, right? Of course. Meanwhile, her children are without their mother. Her social obligations go unfulfilled, right? Whatever they are. She loses her job because she's incarcerated for 2 weeks, right? Because of parking tickets, right? Etc. However, this is not just the story of one sort of sad lady, right? Some towns in St. Louis County derive 40% or more of their annual net revenue from petty fines and fees collected by their municipal courts. A majority of these fines are for traffic offenses, but they can also include fines for fare hopping, that is, Metrolink, playing loud music, noise ordinance violations, zoning violations for uncut or unkempt property, violations of occupancy, permit restrictions. There's even an ordinance about saggy pants, where people can be fined because their pants are inadequately pulled up. Okay. Anyway, in a white paper released a couple of months ago, the Arch City Defenders found a large group of people outside the courthouse in Bell Ridge, which is one of the municipalities in St. Louis County, who had been fined for not subscribing to the town's only approved garbage collection service. They hadn't been fined for having trash on their property, only for not paying for the only legal method the town had designated for disposing of their trash. Okay? In the article, I'm quoting from the article, these aren't violent criminals. These are people who make the same mistakes you or I do: speeding, not wearing a seatbelt, forgetting to get your car inspected on time. The difference is that they don't have the money to pay the fines, or they have kids, or jobs that don't allow them to take off for 2 or 3 court appearances. When you can't pay the fines, you get fined for that too. And when you can't get to court, you get an arrest warrant. Arrest warrants are also public informations. They can be accessed by potential landlords and employers. So they can prevent someone from getting a job, housing, job training, loans, or financial aid. So they just get sucked into this vortex of debt and despair. Right? This is what I mean by a politics of despair. And before we get too comfortable with this, this is not something that only affects the poor. It disproportionately affects the poor, but it doesn't only affect the poor, right? It adds to this feeling of lack of trust and fellow feeling that I talked about at the beginning of the talk. It adds to this increase, right, in inequality, which produces the polarization that we see today, right? The inequality is material, but it's also a political inequality that has real effects in our society, no matter what your socioeconomic status is. It produces a politics that is untenable, right, for the long term. Okay, so where does insurgency come in here? Young offers us this enabling conception of justice, right, that focuses not on what people have, but what people can do, and pairs it with a politics that centers situated individuals who do and act, right? So if the politics of despair produces atomized individuals who feel that they can't do anything in the face of this structural injustice that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, right? Where it affects your life, but it's unclear who to blame, then the antidote to that is to do and act, right? Instead, we have to use our creative, problem-oriented faculty of judgment to inform what John Dewey calls democratic experimentalism, right? And what Young refers to as the emancipatory imagination. It's through democratic insurgency that this emancipatory imagination is awakened and sustained. This emancipatory imagination motivates people to look at their society critically and ask how it can be made more liberating and enabling. However, this motivation and imagination are only a part of the equation. Along with the dreaming of the world, right, which is the way that Langston Hughes put it, there must also be a concrete repoliticization of public life. And that repoliticization takes the form of insurgency, because it's how atomistic individuals come to understand themselves as collectivities that can impact the world, right? That can impact those social structures that seem to be, that not only seem to be, but absolutely are, determining how they're able to do and act in the world. Insurgent campaigns and movements, insurgent campaigns and the movements that they may or may not develop into are often local and spontaneous, though not unorganized, with a sense of limitation. That is, they have a sense of the limits of their acts and particular goals for a particular constituency. And yet, what they do is teach people how to be political again. They teach people democratic efficacy, that they can actually impact the politics of the places that they're in. The principle of insurgent organizing, says Young, which makes it uniquely suited to contemporary politics, rather than kind of older style ideological politics, right? So communist politics or socialist politics, and particularly suited to the zeitgeist of our age, is that the principle of insurgent organizing is not unification, but proliferation. Contemporary insurgencies are local and heterogeneous, with loosely networked groups that coexist as a movement, or as movements, if they do, with a unity of common purpose rather than a common program and tactics that are decided on by a central organization. Here we can refer to Black Lives Matter, or the movement for Black Lives, as an exemplar of this kind of movement, okay? Now, what we know about social movements is that they emerge from more than grievance. Grievances are ever present, resources are scarce, inequality is a fact, and systems of governments, as I've said, tend toward oligarchy and bureaucratization. That is, including democracy. Instead, movements emerge when people come to understand their grievances as being caused by the status quo arrangement of power, while simultaneously coming to believe that protesting that arrangement of power is both urgent and efficacious. This understanding of a grievance as a public problem that has the potential to be solved through the political effort of ordinary people is what social movement scholars call insurgent consciousness. This insurgent consciousness often coalesces and is amplified through injustice frames that activists create. In 21st century movements, like Black Lives Matter, hashtags can come to be injustice frames. Alicia Garza, one of the founders of the Movement for Black Lives, writes that she created Black Lives Matter as a call to action for Black people after 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was posthumously placed on trial for his own murder, and the killer, George Zimmerman, was not held accountable for the crime he committed. It was a response to the anti-Black racism that permeates our society, she writes. For many African American millennials, this was a moment of political discovery, of what Frantz Fanon calls their discovery of the fact of Blackness, or the social and political fact that as a Black person, one will always experience his being through others, having to move through life not only aware of how she will be viewed as an individual, but also as an example of Blackness as it is constructed by the ideology and historiography of white supremacy. I should pause here to make an important point. White supremacy, properly understood and as deployed by the Movement for Black Lives, is not a prejudiced feeling about the superiority of white people. Instead, it is the name of the current state of social relations structured by and operating through institutions and social mores that shapes all of our subjectivities, arranges power, compounds inequality, and distributes privilege based on the historical legacy and continuing daily impact of racial categorization. In other words, white supremacy is a social and political fact which exists among other politically relevant social facts, right? We could also talk about gender here. We could also talk about class here. It is one of the social facts that structures, that is, organizes the consequences of being in the world, right? It organizes the consequences of being in the world. That is, it organizes what we can do, how we can act, and how the fruits of our labors will play out, right, or are likely to play out. Okay? So, this moment of political awakening that was galvanized by Alicia Garza and others through hashtags and through Twitter was, I'm off script. Okay. This moment of political awakening to the effects of white supremacy that many experienced on the acquittal of Martin's killer might have subsided without blossoming from grievance into movement, if not for three factors. The first is the mind-boggling and heart-rending regularity of the trauma of Black deaths at the hands of either vigilantes or law enforcement. The second, the availability of social media to announce, discuss, mourn, analyze, and demand acknowledgement and accountability and justice in the face of these endlessly repeating collective ordeal of loss. And the third is the skillful and dedicated efforts of individuals and organizations across the country, even worldwide, to turn these moments of trauma and rage into sustained and sustaining political insurgency. Okay? It's important to note that this insurgency was not just something that was happening among this group of protesters, okay? The point of political insurgencies is not only to give voice to a collectivity that before did not exist or did not see itself as a collectivity, but also to call out, right, to the rest of society about making your claim, describing the justice of your claim, right? And also orienting people to the problem, right? Okay. For you. Okay, we've talked about some of this, the distributive paradigms. So I want to take you to Janetta Elsie, actually. I'm sorry, I'm having a terrible time with this. Okay. Yes, that one. Okay. The August killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri proved a tipping point for the mobilization of a movement that had been percolating for at least 2 years. DeRay McKesson, a prominent activist in the movement for Black Lives and a co-founder of one of its prominent organizations, Campaign Zero, recounts that he was initially drawn to Ferguson by curiosity. When Trayvon died, he reflects, I just had no clue what the news was. I just didn't know what it was, and I didn't want that to be the story in St. Louis. The demonstrations that erupted on the night following Brown's execution in the street, where his body lay uncovered all day as people gawked and gathered in grief and outrage, were large and grew by the hour. Even so, activist Janetta Elzy, a native of St. Louis, remembers that the sentiment that kept repeating on her social media timelines was one of resignation. It's just another dead Black boy, no one's gonna care. But she reports, I just didn't believe it. All I had was my Twitter and my Facebook and my Tumblr and my Instagram, and I felt that someone somewhere would care about what I was seeing. And indeed, people did care. The coverage of the national cable networks was uneasy, yet attentive, with both CNN and Fox News reporting upticks in their ratings over the 2 weeks that followed the initial uprising on August 9th of 2014. The coverage, though extensive, followed the format of most media coverage of protests and also followed our common sense ideas, right, about protests, being that it was less focused on exploring the reasons for the uprising and more focused on the spectacle of disorder. McKesson observed CNN was sort of painting this picture about chaos, and Twitter and Instagram were painting a different picture. They were painting a picture about pain, and it was that was a call to action. Though he was originally in Ferguson as an observer, a kind of citizen reporter, McKesson recalls, the second night I got tear-gassed. It was the first night of the curfew. It was in that moment that I became a protester. In this transformation from a curious and attentive bystander to an avowed political challenger who was a part of a collectivity, he was not alone. The police response, with law enforcement officers outfitted in military gear pointing war weapons at American citizens as they sat atop armored tanks, was shocking to many. Photos of young people approaching human walls of police in riot gear and videos of officers threatening to kill unarmed Americans exercising their First Amendment rights went viral and caused people of many races to ask themselves and each other, is this our America? As is often the case, especially in democracies, the vividly repressive response of the state turned the public pain, which activists had made coherent in an injustice frame, and communal trauma, which had been forged into shared affect on social media, into a collective action and political demand. This kind of collective action and political demand is necessary for societies like ours. And we should note that Black Lives Matter has already changed politics. It has brought the issue of police brutality to the fore when it was not before. It has brought to the fore the idea that the criminal justice system is in need of reform, in many cases radical reform. The movement for Black Lives has also, in many localities, replaced district attorneys or voted out district attorneys that had been in collusion with police forces that were corrupt, either violently or in terms of financial exploitation of the population, and sometimes both. This kind of democratic insurgency is important for democratic societies in general, especially if we think about justice as something that's not just words on a page, right? It's not just the way that institutions are arranged, but it's actually about the ways that people's lives can go. Okay, I think I'm at time, so I want to take any questions that you have. I have one more slide.